Hey guys, tonight we're slipping into something you probably didn't expect. The strange, slow, slightly sticky world of Dionysus, god of wine, who once decided he should run his vineyard like an accounting office. Imagine you, sandals squeaking, trudging through rows of grapes, not with a goblet, but with a papyrus ledger under your arm. The cicadas buzz, the air is heavy with sweet fermentation, and somewhere in the distance, a satyr is already tipsy before breakfast. You probably won't survive this work week. It's grape season after all, and the numbers won't tally themselves. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing those sleepy check-ins. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You arrive at the vineyard gates, which are less like polished marble and more like a squeaky wooden archway with ivy stubbornly clinging to its edges. Dionysus is there, hair a little wild, robe slipping off one shoulder, holding a scroll he clearly hasn't read. "We're modernizing," he announces. "No more chaos, no more barrels just left in the sun. From now on, we keep ledgers." He says it like an oracle predicting the future of finance. And you nod politely, though you know full well the only math happening here is wine plus me equals nap. He ushers you into a makeshift office, really just a shaded pergola with grapevines hanging low enough to bonk you on the head. The smell of fermenting juice mixes with the scratch of quills on papyrus. Dionysus gestures to a table stacked with amphorae, each with clumsy chalk marks. "Inventory," he says. You suspect most of these jars are half empty, but the system is, well, creative. A mainstream historical fact drifts in here. Ancient vineyards did rely heavily on manual tallying. Greek farmers often scratched harvest counts onto shards of pottery, called ostraca, before more formal records came later. You can almost picture one of those shards, smeared with grape must, tossed aside as a satyr trips over it. Now comes the first joke of the day. Dionysus insists on a dress code. Not togas, no, business casual tunics. You glance at the satyrs in question, one with a tie made of grapevines wrapped awkwardly around his hairy chest. He looks proud, though the leaves keep slipping into his goblet. The workday begins, and Dionysus hands you a quill. You'll log the morning harvest. Every cluster matters. You dip the quill into ink and immediately splatter a blot onto your tunic. "Occupational hazard?" Dionysus chuckles before tripping on his own sandals. A quirky tidbit creeps in. Some scholars suggest Dionysian cults in real history had ecstatic bookkeeping rituals, where numbers were chanted like prayers. Historians still argue whether these were symbolic tallies of wine jars or simply enthusiastic miscounts after too much sampling. Either way, you're imagining the first accountant/priest rhythmically chanting, 4 jars, 5 jars, 6 jars. Oh wait, did we drink one? The hours drag on. Bees buzz lazily. A nymph nearby argues with a satyr over who miscounted the baskets, and Dionysus keeps stopping mid-sentence to sip directly from the amphora marked "Do Not Touch." You glance at the ledger. Ink blotches everywhere. Grapes squashed between the pages. You realize this office has all the discipline of a toga party at 3 a.m. Still, the god is determined. He waves his arms dramatically. With these ledgers, we will conquer inefficiency. No more lost jars, no more spilled amphorae. Just then, one of the satyrs sneezes violently, knocking over 2 amphorae that roll away, spilling wine across the dirt floor. You stare. Dionysus clears his throat. That will be filed under miscellaneous expenses. You keep writing, line after line, your quill scratching like a cricket song, and slowly, absurdly, you begin to drift into the rhythm. Numbers, jars, baskets, clusters. The vineyard hums like an office gone feral, where every column of grapes is another balance sheet, and every breeze carries the faint scent of fermentation. By the time the sun slides low, Dionysus is already slumped in his chair, smiling faintly at the chaos. You close the ledger, smudged fingers sticky with ink and grape juice. Somehow, you've survived your first day in the vineyard office, though your tunic may never recover. The next morning, you shuffle back into the vineyard office, still wearing a tunic blotched with ink and grape stains from yesterday. Dionysus is already awake, or at least awake-ish, sitting cross-legged on a crate of figs with a scroll unrolled across his knees. Every office needs staff, he announces grandly, as if he's unveiling a decree from Zeus himself. And today, that means hiring satyrs as accountants. You swallow hard. This is not going to end well. They come tumbling in from the fields, hooves clattering on stone, tails swishing, laughter echoing far too loud for the early hour. One satyr carries a half-empty amphora under his arm. Another drags along a flute, tooting cheerfully off-key. Dionysus claps his hands. Gentlemen, and whatever else you might be, welcome to the Vineyard Accounting Department. The satyrs cheer like he just promised them free wine for eternity. You're handed the duty of orientation officer. That means showing them where the papyrus stacks are stored and how to hold a quill without chewing on it. Within minutes, one satyr has dipped his entire tail into the ink jar. Another has mistaken the ledger margins for doodle space, and a third insists the amphora inventory should be measured not in jars, but in happy size after drinking. And here's your mainstream historical fact of the day. In actual Greek society, vineyard laborers were usually free peasants or enslaved workers, not mythical goat-legged creatures. Satyrs existed only in the myths and plays, where they were portrayed as rowdy, mischievous, and easily distracted. Basically, the opposite of what you want in a bookkeeping team. You glance at the chaos and think, yep, mythology checks out. One satyr does show promise. He squints at the papyrus, tongue sticking out in concentration, and painstakingly draws neat vertical lines like tally marks. But then he writes next to them, 1 jug for me, 1 jug for Dionysus, 1 jug for later, and 1 jug for emergencies. You suppose that's a system, though the emergencies seem suspiciously frequent. A quirky tidbit slips in here. Ancient vineyards often relied on seasonal festivals, and in Dionysian rituals, goats were sometimes sacrificed. Historians still argue whether this practice symbolized protecting the vines from real goat damage, or simply providing an excuse for feasting. Now imagine trying to explain to these satyrs that in some traditions, their cousins were more menu than management. Probably not the best icebreaker. You call for a staff meeting. Dionysus stands dramatically at the front, vine crown slightly crooked. "This office will bring order to the chaos of wine," he proclaims, gesturing to amphorae stacked behind him. One satyr sneezes, another belches, and a third raises his hand to ask if naps are included in the work schedule. You suppress a sigh. Here comes your first joke of the day. One satyr insists on being the chief financial hoofvicer. He wears a wreath of ivy like a tie, struts proudly, and demands his own desk. His desk is actually a barrel, which he promptly opens and drains halfway through the meeting. Dionysus applauds. That's leadership. By midday, the team is scribbling half numbers, doodles of grapes, and occasional poems about nymphs in the margins of your ledgers. You try to remind them that numbers are sacred, that every cluster must be counted, but they only giggle and argue about whether grape skins taste better before or after fermentation. Somewhere in this madness, Dionysus leans towards you and whispers conspiratorially, "See? They'll grow into the role. Every office has a learning curve." You glance at a satyr currently balancing 2 amphorae on his head while humming, and you're not so sure this curve isn't a cliff. As the day wanes, you realize that your vineyard office is no longer just a workplace. It's a carnival disguised as administration. The satyrs may never master double-entry bookkeeping, but they've certainly mastered double-fisting goblets of wine. You close the ledger once again, pages smudged with both ink and hoofprints, wondering how much longer you can keep the numbers straight. The following day begins with optimism. Your optimism, not theirs. You step into the vineyard office, clutching a fresh quill, determined that today will finally bring a sense of order. Dionysus greets you by dramatically unfurling a scroll titled "Necessary Office Supplies." You brace yourself. If yesterday was about hiring, today is about tools, and already you suspect tools will mean something very different in this vineyard. On the list: quills, ink, papyrus, amphorae, wax tablets, and one very stubborn donkey to haul the amphorae. "Essential transport," Dionysus explains, patting the donkey's flank as if it were a prized chariot horse. The donkey immediately tries to nibble the papyrus stack. You gather the satyrs for a supply briefing, but the moment you explain that quills must be dipped lightly into ink, one satyr plunges his entire quill in up to the feather, flicking droplets like black rain across the pergola roof. Another decides papyrus sheets make excellent paper airplanes. He launches one, which sails lazily through the vines before sticking to a grape cluster. "Precision filing," he claims proudly. Mainstream historical fact to ground you. Papyrus was indeed fragile and expensive. Ancient clerks often reused shards of broken pottery for drafts before committing records to papyrus, a thrifty move that saved money. You can't help thinking pottery shards would have been safer here than papyrus around satyrs who treat scrolls like napkins. The amphorae, meanwhile, become multi-purpose. Officially, they're meant to hold wine inventory. Unofficially, one satyr uses an empty one as a stool, another as a drum, and a third tries to nap inside one, snoring loudly while Dionysus pretends not to notice. "Resourcefulness," he declares, as if this were a productivity hack. Now for your quirky tidbit. Archaeologists once discovered amphorae coated with pitch and even lined with resin to preserve wine longer. Historians still argue whether these methods were strictly practical or had ritualistic meaning. Here in your office, though, the amphorae are definitely serving as percussion instruments, storage closets, and, in one unfortunate case, a makeshift chamber pot. You try to organize the supplies into neat categories. Quills here, papyrus there, amphorae stacked in rows. But the satyrs are more interested in decorating them. They smear grape juice across the amphorae like finger paint, scrawling crude caricatures of Zeus, which look suspiciously like angry potatoes. You roll your eyes, because you know Dionysus will call this artistic expression in tomorrow's meeting. Here's your light joke quota. Dionysus insists the office needs a filing cabinet. You point out those don't exist yet. He pauses, frowns, and then declares, "Fine, we'll just use this hollow tree stump." He crams scrolls into it until the bark bulges. A squirrel immediately emerges, furious at the intrusion, and pelts you with acorns. You add angry squirrel attacks to the expense report. By midday, chaos reigns again. Ink jars have toppled, papyrus sheets flutter across the vineyard like lazy birds, and the donkey has chewed through 3 pages of the ledger. Dionysus shrugs, pours himself a cup of diluted wine, and mutters, "All offices have overhead." Still, there is something oddly soothing in the repetition. You dip quill after quill, jotting numbers, blotting stains, recording every amphora, even as satyrs juggle figs nearby. The sunlight dapples through the vines, turning the ink blotches into little constellations on the page. And you think, maybe this is just what administration looks like in a god's domain. Half chaos, half beauty, wholly unmanageable. As evening falls, Dionysus calls it a day. He waves at the smudged ledgers and tilted amphorae with pride, as though you've accomplished something monumental. "We're building an empire," he says dreamily. You glance at the donkey now snoring under the pergola and wonder what kind of empire sleeps inside its own paperwork. The morning haze hangs low across the vineyard when you return, and for once, you convince yourself the day might actually run smoothly. Dionysus, however, has other plans. He's perched on a stool, if you can call a wine barrel a stool, announcing, "Every office must have meetings, and so today, we gather for the first staff meeting of the Vineyard Accounting Department." You sigh, knowing full well this is going to last longer than it should and involve far fewer numbers than advertised. The satyrs straggle in, some still half asleep, others already chewing on grape clusters like they're popcorn at a theater. A couple of nymphs drift by too, curious to see what an office meeting entails. They perch daintily on the edge of an amphora, whispering to each other and stifling giggles. Dionysus slaps the papyrus agenda on the table with a flourish. "Item 1, he proclaims, balance sheets." You begin explaining how balance sheets are supposed to track assets and debts, but halfway through, one satyr interrupts with, "But aren't grapes infinite?" Another adds, "And if wine evaporates into the air, does it count as profit for the clouds?" You pinch the bridge of your nose, realizing that your attempt at order has already derailed into metaphysics. Mainstream historical fact here. The ancient Greeks did practice forms of accounting, especially in city-states where temples doubled as treasuries. In Athens, for example, temple records carefully tracked donations and expenditures, often inscribed on stone tablets for public viewing. You imagine what would happen if Dionysus tried that. Half the inscriptions would probably read, "2 amphorae spilled during dance." A quirky tidbit slips in. Some scholars believe early Greek accounting included oral traditions, where numbers were sung aloud in rhythmic chants to aid memory. Historians still argue whether this was simply a mnemonic device or a ritual act. Either way, looking around this meeting, you're fairly sure the satyrs chanting 2 jugs, 3 jugs, hiccup are not advancing scholarly research. Dionysus tries to regain focus. Item 2, stain management. He gestures at the ledgers now blotched with purple fingerprints and grape juice smears. The nymphs burst into laughter, covering their mouths. One points out that no balance sheet can be taken seriously if it looks like an abstract painting. You have to admit, she's not wrong. Then comes your light joke of the day. Dionysus unveils a pie chart, which is literally just a smashed fig tart on a plate. "Visual aids," he says proudly. A satyr immediately eats the evidence. You don't even bother to write that one down. The discussion drifts further. One satyr demands ergonomic seating. His amphora barrel is bad for posture. Another insists on coffee breaks, though nobody in ancient Greece has invented coffee yet. Dionysus waves these aside with lofty promises about increased efficiency after lunch feasts. Still, there's something oddly mesmerizing about it all. The nymphs' laughter, the warm smell of fermenting grapes, the low drone of satyrs arguing whether a basket of figs counts as an asset or a liability. The meeting sprawls lazily like a summer afternoon, more performance than productivity. By the end, Dionysus raises his goblet. "Minutes will be recorded," he declares solemnly. You glance at the page. It reads, "Meeting adjourned. Everyone drank. Ledgers remain sticky." That's about as accurate as you'll ever get. As the sun dips lower, the satyrs wander back to their chaos. The nymphs skip away into the vines, and you close the papyrus agenda with relief. First meeting done. First meeting useless. But hey, you survived, and in Dionysus's world, that's an accomplishment worth noting. The satyrs are still groggy from yesterday's meeting when Dionysus bursts in this morning, waving a ledger as though it's a divine proclamation. "From today," he announces, "we create the ledger of grapes. Every cluster, every berry, every sticky handful shall be tallied with the precision of Apollo's lyre." You take one look at the smudged papyrus and already feel your wrist cramp in sympathy. Your new assignment? Count the grapes. Not the amphorae, not the baskets. Literally, the grapes. Dionysus insists this is necessary for quality control and transparency. You mutter under your breath that it sounds more like madness. He doesn't notice. He's too busy dipping his quill with the grandiosity of an oracle. You and the satyrs fan out into the vineyard rows. Sunlight spills through the leaves, dappling your shoulders, while cicadas sing their endless summer drone. You tug at clusters heavy with juice and start scribbling. 12 grapes here, 17 there. Within 5 minutes, you realize this is impossible. By the time you finish counting one cluster, a satyr has eaten half of another. Mainstream historical fact. The Greeks did cultivate vineyards carefully, and records show harvest counts were often estimated by weight or basket load, not individual grapes. Practicality, after all, was essential in large-scale agriculture. But practicality has never been Dionysus's strong suit. The satyrs, of course, invent their own systems. One counts in dance steps. 3 hops, 4 hops, hiccup. Another decides to measure grapes against his handspan, declaring, "This cluster is worth 2 satyr palms." A third simply draws a doodle of a goat for every 10 grapes, which quickly fills half a scroll with cartoon livestock. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some scholars suggest that in Dionysian rituals, grapes weren't just food, but symbols of rebirth and transformation. Historians still argue whether grape counting had any sacred significance, or was just a convenient excuse for wine-fueled celebrations. Standing there with your ink-stained fingers, you lean toward the latter. By midday, your papyrus is dripping with numbers and juice stains. A satyr nearby tries to balance his tally sheet on a vine, only to have a goat chew it in half. Dionysus beams. "Even the goats want to participate." You're not so sure the gods of Olympus would consider goat digestion an accounting method. Light joke of the day. Dionysus insists you sign off every completed page with an official seal. Unfortunately, no wax is available. His solution? Just press a grape into it. You comply, squishing purple blobs onto each corner, which quickly smudge into sticky fingerprints. Congratulations, you've invented fruit stamp notarization. The hours crawl by, and you find yourself lulled by the repetition. Grapes, quill, scribble, grapes, quill, scribble. The air smells sharp and sweet. The satyr's laughter rises and falls like background music. Despite the absurdity, there's a meditative rhythm in it, an odd comfort in surrendering to impossible math. As the sun slides low, you shuffle back to the pergola with your grape-smeared pages. Dionysus holds them up like trophies. "Behold," he declares, "the first comprehensive grape ledger in history." You squint at the mess of numbers, doodles, and stains. It looks less like a ledger and more like a preschool art project. Still, you let him have his moment. Because here in the vineyard, success isn't accuracy, it's survival. And somehow, you've survived another day of divine bureaucracy. Grapes counted, ledgers closed, sandals hopelessly sticky. By now, you've grown used to Dionysus waking you with new policies, as if the vineyard were an empire. Today, though, the decree is not about grapes or ledgers. It's about wine-tasting audits. Every serious business, he insists, must test its product. We can't just trust the jars blindly. You sigh, already knowing where this is headed. Another day of drinking disguised as work. The satyrs, of course, cheer. They line up eagerly, quills abandoned, papyrus forgotten, each clutching a goblet. Dionysus sets out amphorae like they're files to be reviewed. "We must sip carefully," he explains. "Small tastes, thoughtful notes, meticulous comparison." The first satyr downs an entire cup in one gulp, then shouts, "Notes! Fruity? Excellent! Refill, please!" Dionysus beams as if this were exactly the rigorous method he envisioned. Mainstream historical fact. The Greeks were meticulous about mixing wine with water, usually 3 parts water to 1 part wine. Drinking it straight was seen as barbaric, even dangerous. You mention this, but Dionysus waves you off. Yes, moderation is important. After the first 6 cups, the audit proceeds. Amphora after amphora is opened, poured, sampled. Satyrs stumble, nymphs giggle. Dionysus makes dramatic faces of concentration, swirling his goblet as if judging a royal vintage. You dutifully try to record their notes. One satyr says, "A jar tastes like summer thunder." Another says, "Like kissing a fig tree." A third declares his jar tastes like Zeus's sandals after rain, which you decide not to write down for the sake of your own sanity. quirky tidbit. Some ancient writers claimed certain wines had medicinal properties, used for everything from digestion to easing headaches. Historians still argue whether those claims were genuine observations or just excuses to drink more. Watching Dionysus declare one amphora a cure for boredom, you lean toward the latter. Your light joke of the day comes courtesy of Dionysus himself. He announces a scoring system. Each wine must be rated from 1 to 5 goblets. But instead of tallying marks, the satyrs just pile empty goblets next to each amphora. By the end of the afternoon, the 5-goblet wines are surrounded by precarious towers of cups, ready to topple at the slightest breeze. Of course, not all the audits go smoothly. One amphora turns out to be half vinegar from sitting in the sun too long. Dionysus frowns, declares it innovative, and insists it will be rebranded as Special Reserve. Another jar spills entirely when a satyr tries to carry it on his head. The spill soaks your sandals, the papyrus sheets, and half the donkey, who brays indignantly. Dionysus shrugs. Every audit has losses. Still, as the sun dips low and the cicadas quiet, there's something oddly calming about the whole charade. The smell of wine and resin fills the air. The satyr's laughter blends into the hum of evening, and your quill scratches half-hearted tasting notes onto pages already curling with damp. You find yourself lulled into a kind of trance, the chaos somehow hypnotic. By twilight, most of the satyrs are asleep on the ground, goblets still clutched in their hands. Dionysus, grinning ear to ear, holds up the final ledger. A successful audit, he declares. You look at the wine-stained scroll, filled with phrases like cloudy but charming, and tastes like victory naps. It may not impress Zeus, but here, in this office-turned-bacchanal, it passes for accounting. You wake the next morning with a faint headache, not from drinking, but from inhaling too many fumes of yesterday's audit. The vineyard is buzzing again, but today the chaos isn't about grapes or tasting notes. Dionysus has invited a visitor. Hermes, the quick-footed messenger of the gods, swoops down in a flash of winged sandals and lands squarely on the pergola roof. Papers flutter, satyrs squeal, and you already know this can't be good. Taxes, Hermes says flatly, brushing dust off his cloak. He holds out a scroll sealed with Zeus's thunderbolt insignia. Olympus demands its share, and, the paperwork is due. Dionysus blinks as though Hermes just spoke another language. Paper. What? The god of messengers rolls his eyes. Documentation, Dion. Receipts. Itemized lists. You can't just throw a party and expect divine revenue to sort itself. Mainstream historical fact. Ancient Greek city-states did levy taxes, though not in the way we imagine today. Many were paid in kind. Produce, animals, or services instead of coins. In Athens, a particularly infamous form was the liturgia, where wealthy citizens had to sponsor festivals or warships. You realize with some dread that Dionysus is about to try to pay Olympus in wine barrels and goat songs. The satyrs panic, scattering like children caught skipping school. One insists on hiding the ledgers under a pile of grape leaves. Another tries to bribe Hermes directly with raisins, dropping a handful into his palm. Hermes stares, unimpressed. Bribery is an additional tax, he deadpans. A quirky tidbit sneaks into your thoughts. Hermes himself was often worshipped as a god of commerce, trade, and even thieves. Historians still argue whether his cult emphasized honest markets or celebrated clever trickery. Watching him smirk as he pockets the raisins, you're inclined to think both. Dionysus scrambles for an excuse. "We've been modernizing! Look at our ledgers!" He shoves the grape-smeared scrolls into Hermes's hands. The messenger squints at entries like "one amphora lost to squirrel interference" and "miscellaneous joy expenses." He looks back at you, eyebrow raised. You give a helpless shrug. Light joke of the day. Dionysus declares he will innovate the tax system by creating wine-backed currency. He presents a clay token, promising it can be redeemed for 1 amphora at any time. Hermes snorts. "Congratulations. You've invented the IOU, the satyrs cheer, as though this is revolutionary banking." Still, Hermes is not entirely humorless. He leafs through the ledgers, sighs, and mutters, "I've seen worse." He recalls once collecting taxes from Apollo, whose records were just endless lists of lyre strings. Dionysus claps him on the back, declaring, "See? Progress." Hermes, adjusting his cloak, warns, "Zeus won't be pleased. Sort this out before the next audit," and with a gust of wind, he's gone. The satyrs breathe a collective sigh of relief, though one hiccups loudly, ruining the dramatic pause. Dionysus, unfazed, raises a goblet. "We've survived the first Olympus audit." You're not sure if "survived" is the right word, but given the state of the paperwork, it's close enough. As the evening hums back to life, you scratch the day's events into the ledger. Hermes arrived. Taxes demanded. Raisins confiscated. IOUS invented. Another absurd chapter in the office saga. And you can't shake the feeling that Olympus will be back sooner than you'd like. The vineyard feels strangely quiet this morning. Too quiet. You follow the sound of faint muttering under the pergola and find the nymphs gathered in a circle, brows furrowed. Dryads, naiads, and even a few passing maenads, all talking at once. Dionysus is pacing, tugging at his ivy crown like a man in the middle of a boardroom crisis. "Payroll," he groans. "They want payroll." Yes, today is payday, and apparently being paid in the joy of eternal wine isn't cutting it anymore. The nymphs cross their arms. One speaks up. "We worked all week tallying grapes, writing numbers, stomping amphora leaks. We deserve fair wages." Another adds, "And not in leftover vinegar, thank you." Mainstream historical fact. In ancient economies, agricultural workers were often paid in food or wine rations rather than coin. Some festivals even distributed wages in kind: bread, figs, or diluted wine. But here, you're watching divine labor relations spiral into something resembling a union meeting. Dionysus flips open the ledger. "We can offer fermented figs, garlands of ivy, maybe a goat or two." The nymphs groan in unison. A satyr whispers to you, "Maybe throw in some sandals?" These girls love sandals. You're not sure that's a sustainable HR policy. A quirky tidbit drifts in. Scholars note that ancient cults dedicated to Dionysus sometimes offered their followers symbolic payments in tokens or feasts. Historians still argue whether these were true wages or just ritual participation rewards. Looking at the unimpressed nymphs, you suspect a feast won't be enough this time. One dryad slaps down a list of demands scribbled on papyrus. Consistent rations, fair distribution of amphorae, and time off during the hottest hours of the day. Dionysus blinks, reads it upside down, then declares, "We'll settle this with a dance-off." The nymphs do not laugh. Here's your light joke of the day. To sweeten the deal, Dionysus offers them a new benefits package: free ivy crowns with every payday. A nymph lifts hers, wilted and sticky from yesterday's heat, and deadpans. That's not a benefit. That's compost. The negotiations stretch all afternoon. Satyrs hover nervously, afraid their own wages might be reduced to goat feed. Dionysus scribbles figures furiously, trying to make amphora allocations look impressive. Finally, you step in, suggesting a compromise. Partial payment in wine, partial in fresh fruit, and the occasional theater ticket, since Dionysus controls half the stages in Greece anyway. Reluctantly, the nymphs agree. The pergola sighs with relief as the dispute fizzles into laughter. One nymph even teases Dionysus. Next time, just invent coins like everyone else. He chuckles, promising innovation while clearly having no intention of doing so. As twilight settles, you record the outcome in the ledger. Payroll crisis averted. Wages now include figs, diluted wine, and matinee tickets. Not exactly revolutionary finance, but in this vineyard office, it counts as progress. And as you put down your quill, you realize you've just survived the first labor negotiation in divine history. Congratulations. You're now part accountant, part mediator, part mythological HR manager. When you arrive the next morning, Dionysus is sprawled across a desk that looks more like a toppled stack of amphora lids. He jolts upright, eyes wild, and thrusts a scroll into your hands. Expense reports, he declares. Every business must track its spending. Today, we do just that. You glance at the scroll. Half the entries are doodles of ivy crowns and goats. This is going to be a long day. The satyrs shuffle in reluctantly, still sticky from spilled wine, carrying more half-filled goblets than papyrus sheets. Dionysus clears his throat and announces, "We must record every drachma, every fig, every sandal strap spent on the vineyard office. Accuracy is key." Immediately, one satyr raises his hand. "Do hangovers count as expenses?" Dionysus claps his hands delightedly. "Yes, health expenditures. You bury your face in your palm." Mainstream historical fact. The Greeks really did keep track of expenses for state projects, from building temples to hosting festivals. Surviving inscriptions show detailed lists of costs. Stone, labor, sacrifices, all chiseled for public accountability. You can't imagine chiseling this office's expenses in stone. The masons would quit halfway through 2 amphorae lost to donkey tantrum. The first entries are predictable enough. Quills, papyrus, ink, amphora repairs. But soon the list turns bizarre. One satyr files a reimbursement for theatrical mask polish. Another claims 5 ivy crowns, lost in wrestling match. Dionysus himself lists 3 theater tickets under professional development. You ask what performance he attended. He shrugs. "My own play. Research purposes." Here's your quirky tidbit. Ancient Greek theaters sometimes doubled as spaces for political assembly and civic announcements. Historians still argue whether Dionysian plays were purely entertainment or subtle commentary on civic life. Watching Dionysus justify theater tickets as a tax write-off, you suspect he'd argue for both. Your light joke arrives when a satyr submits an expense labeled "sandals for goat." You ask why the goat needs sandals. He explains earnestly, to avoid hoof blisters when walking to the vineyard. Dionysus approves the claim immediately, sketching a tiny sandal-wearing goat in the margin. By midday, the ledger is overflowing with questionable costs. Someone files for emergency fig rations, another for donkey bribe to keep quiet, and yet another for incense to mask smell of spilled wine. You try to consolidate them into neat columns, but Dionysus insists on a more fluid system, expenses organized by mood rather than category. Today feels like frivolous luxuries, he says, scribbling the phrase across an entire page. As the afternoon sun slants across the pergola, you realize the expense report is less a document and more a mythic poem of chaos. Dionysus stands proudly over it, declaring, "This proves our office is thriving." You glance at the columns of doodles, smudges, and sandal receipts and wonder if thriving is another word for utterly unhinged. Still, when you close the ledger at day's end, you can't help but smile. It may not impress Olympus's accountants, but this expense report tells the true story of life in the Vineyard office. Messy, illogical, occasionally hilarious, but undeniably alive. The next day dawns heavy with gossip. You don't even make it past the first row of vines before you overhear two satyrs whispering furiously. By the time you reach the pergola, the entire accounting department is buzzing louder than a hive of bees. Dionysus sits with his goblet, pretending to be absorbed in a papyrus scroll, but his ears are clearly tuned to every word. Today, it seems, the Vineyard office has been overtaken by rumors. One nymph leans in, stage whispering, "Did you hear? Apollo's offering free lyre lessons on Mount Parnassus." Another satyr chimes in, "Apparently he gives out golden quills to his best students." A third insists that Hermes is secretly opening a rival delivery business, complete with faster donkeys. You roll your eyes, realizing none of this has anything to do with grapes or ledgers. Mainstream historical fact. Gossip wasn't just idle chatter in the ancient world. It was a tool of influence. In Athens, public opinion was shaped heavily by rumor, sometimes even guiding political outcomes. Plays performed at festivals often lampooned leaders, spreading stories that lingered long after the chorus stopped singing. Here in the Vineyard, though, the gossip is more likely to derail today's balance sheet than topple a government. A quirky tidbit surfaces. Ancient satyr plays, performed alongside tragedies, were filled with bawdy humor and irreverence, poking fun at gods and mortals alike. Historians still argue whether they served as catharsis after heavy dramas or simply comic relief for wine-soaked audiences. Judging by the satyrs now reenacting a parody of Dionysus tripping over his own ivy crown, you'd say the tradition is alive and well. Your light joke of the day arrives courtesy of Dionysus himself. To quell the distraction, he calls for official office gossip minutes. He hands you a quill and insists you record every rumor as though it were a financial entry. You dutifully write, "Rumor, Apollo giving free lessons. Expense, potential loss of staff morale." The satyrs cheer, delighted to see their chatter immortalized in ink. Of course, gossip spreads like spilled wine. Soon, nymphs are whispering that Hera herself might inspect the vineyard. Others mutter about Zeus banning grape counting altogether. A satyr claims Artemis once tried to run a hunting lodge with balance sheets, but quit after wolves ate the payroll. You know most of it is nonsense, yet you can't deny the entertainment value. By mid-afternoon, no actual accounting has been done. The satyrs are giggling. The nymphs are dramatizing rumors as though staging a play, and Dionysus lounges with a self-satisfied grin. "You see," he says, "gossip builds community. It's team building," you groan, wondering how you'll explain this entry in the next audit. As evening falls, you close the ledger, pages cluttered with half-truths and doodled caricatures. Dionysus raises his goblet. "To rumors," he toasts, "the lifeblood of every office." You sip reluctantly. knowing full well that tomorrow the gossip will start all over again. Probably louder, probably wilder, and definitely at the expense of productivity. The harvest season descends like a tidal wave. You wake to the clang of amphorae lids, the braying of the donkey, and satyrs already tumbling through the vines with baskets strapped to their backs. Dionysus, crown tilted sideways, bellows, "The great harvest begins!" And suddenly the Vineyard office is less an office and more a battlefield of sticky sandals and overflowing ledgers. You're handed 3 tasks at once. Tally the baskets, record the amphorae fills, and stop the satyrs from eating half the grapes before they're stored. Easier said than done. Within minutes, one satyr trips, spilling grapes across the ground like marbles. Another sneaks clusters into his mouth as fast as he drops them in the basket. The donkey, sensing opportunity, chomps on a vine with smug satisfaction. Mainstream historical fact: harvest time in ancient vineyards was a massive communal effort. Entire families, and often hired laborers, worked from sunrise to sunset. Grapes had to be processed quickly before spoiling. Inscriptions from Greek estates show the urgency of recording yields, since taxes and trade depended on it. Looking at your smeared, half-legible ledger, you realize no empire would ever trust these numbers. Quirky tidbit: some accounts mention that ancient workers stomped grapes in large vats, their feet providing the pressure to release juice. Historians still argue whether this practice was purely functional or if it carried symbolic, even ritualistic meaning. You glance at 2 satyrs gleefully stomping barefoot, splashing wine all over the pergola floor, and decide this is probably more ritual fun than serious production. By midday, the office is drowning in chaos. Grapes roll under tables, quills snap from overuse, and your papyrus sheets curl from juice stains. Dionysus insists you record every single amphora filled, yet he keeps stopping to sample them, which immediately ruins your count. "Quality assurance!" he shouts through purple-stained lips. Here's your light joke of the day. A satyr invents a new unit of measurement called sticky sandals. 1 amphora equals 3 sticky sandals, depending on how much juice has splattered. Dionysus applauds the creativity, while you bury your head in the ledger, muttering that this isn't how accounting works. The pressure builds. By evening, amphorae tower precariously, papyrus sheets lie scattered, and the air is heavy with the scent of fermenting fruit. Everyone is exhausted, sticky, and more than a little tipsy from sampling. Yet Dionysus beams as if presiding over a triumphal parade. You close the ledger with trembling fingers, pages nearly glued together with juice. Today's entry reads like a fever dream. Baskets innumerable, amphorae collapsing, sandals ruined. And though you're too tired to argue, you can't help but laugh. Because in this vineyard office, even disaster has its own strange rhythm, and somehow you've survived another day. The vineyard is barely recovering from the chaos of harvest when a shadow falls across the pergola. It isn't a passing cloud. It's Hera. The Queen of Olympus herself strides in, regal and terrifying, her gown trailing like thunderclouds across the dirt. Satyrs freeze mid-giggle, nymphs scatter behind amphorae, and even Dionysus straightens his ivy crown as if pretending this is a respectable office. You, quill in hand, feel like an intern about to be grilled by the scariest manager in existence. Hera's voice is cool and sharp. "I've come to audit your books." The words hit harder than Zeus's thunderbolt. Dionysus flashes a nervous smile, gesturing toward the grape-smeared ledgers piled precariously on a table. All in order, a model of efficiency. You glance at the pages, remembering yesterday's entries. Amphorae, innumerable. Sandals, ruined. Not exactly confidence-inspiring, mainstream historical fact. Audits were very real in the ancient world. Temples, which doubled as treasuries, often had officials inspect accounts. In Athens, public officials could even face trials if money was mismanaged. You can't help imagining Dionysus hauled before a jury, trying to explain sticky sandals as a valid unit of measurement. Hera flips open a ledger, frowning at the smudged ink. "What is this?" she demands, pointing at a doodle of a goat wearing sandals. Dionysus beams. "Innovation!" She is not impressed. She flips to another page. "Quality assurance. Drank entire amphora." Her eyebrow arches so high you're certain it could slice marble. Quirky tidbit. Some ancient writers suggest that myths of Hera's sternness reflected real anxieties about accountability in Greek society. Historians still argue whether her reputation as a jealous, watchful goddess was shaped by domestic myths or political necessity. Watching her glare at Dionysus, you think it was probably both. Here's your light joke of the day. Hera demands receipts. Dionysus gestures grandly to the ground, where grape skins litter the dirt. "There are your receipts," he says. The satyrs burst into laughter until Hera silences them with a single glare that could curdle wine. The audit drags on painfully. Hera questions every line item. Why did expenses include donkey bribe? Why was payroll distributed as fermented figs plus theater tickets? Why are half the pages sealed with grape smudges instead of wax? Dionysus deflects, improvises, and occasionally hides behind his goblet. You're forced to explain most of it, spinning chaos into something resembling logic. By twilight, Hera sighs, closing the ledger with a snap. "This," she says, "is the worst accounting I've ever seen." But somehow, she gestures at the vineyard alive with laughter, music, and overflowing amphorae. It works. Against all reason, it works. She gives you one last piercing look. Keep it from collapsing, or Olympus will intervene. With that, she vanishes in a swirl of divine light. The satyrs erupt into cheers of relief. Dionysus collapses onto a barrel, raising his goblet high. "A successful audit," he proclaims. "You add today's entry to the ledger. Hera visited. Terrifying. Books survived. Barely." And as the night settles in, you realize you've just witnessed the first divine audit in history and lived to tell the tale. The vineyard feels quieter after Hera's stormy inspection, but your mind lingers on the aftermath. As you sit under the pergola, quill poised over another sticky papyrus sheet, you notice a different kind of noise brewing. Not satyr gossip, not nymph payroll demands, but the low murmur of arguments from visitant scholars. They've arrived like moths to a lantern, curious about this strange experiment in divine bookkeeping. One scholar adjusts his cloak and mutters, "Surely this entire tale is allegory, a satire of bureaucracy." Another insists, No, it's evidence of an early myth about agricultural record-keeping." A third scribbles frantically, saying, "Perhaps it's not history at all, but an invention by playwrights." You sip from a cup of diluted wine, wondering if you've accidentally become a case study. Mainstream historical fact. Myths were often reshaped by playwrights like Euripides or Aristophanes, who used gods as stand-ins to critique society. It wasn't unusual for Dionysus himself to appear in plays, bumbling and comic, a mirror of human folly. Looking at your ledgers filled with goat doodles and sandal expenses, you suspect you're living inside one of those parodies. A quirky tidbit surfaces. In the 19th century, scholars debated whether Dionysus was originally a foreign god imported into Greece, his cult stitched together from older rituals. Historians still argue whether the myths represent genuine rural practices or symbolic storytelling. You chuckle softly. If they could see this Vineyard office, they'd argue about whether the donkey's sandal receipts were symbolic too. Your light joke of the day comes when one scholar demands to see primary sources. Dionysus proudly hands him the grape-stained ledger. The man studies a page with the entry expense, 2 amphorae lost to squirrel interference, and nods solemnly. Compelling evidence, he says. The satyrs collapse in laughter, rolling on the ground. The debates swell throughout the day. Some claim your vineyard is proof that gods once dabbled in administration. Others argue it's metaphor for chaos resisting order. One insists this is simply a bedtime story gone too far. Through it all, Dionysus lounges happily, sipping wine and declaring, all interpretations are correct if they end in celebration. By nightfall, the scholars pack up their scrolls, muttering about symposium presentations and unfinished theories. You close the ledger, jotting the day's note. Scholars debated existence of office. Productivity, 0. Entertainment, high. And as the stars prick the sky, you realize the Vineyard office has outgrown itself. It's now a myth within a myth, a story debated by mortals and immortals alike. Morning light seeps through the vines, but instead of the usual buzz of satyrs and nymphs, you hear raised voices. You hurry under the pergola to find pandemonium. Ledgers scattered, amphorae toppled, satyrs shouting about unpaid overtime, and nymphs waving papyrus petitions. Dionysus, bleary-eyed, sits slumped on a crate, his ivy crown crooked, muttering, "It's all collapsing." Yes, the Vineyard office is crumbling. The satyrs have staged what looks suspiciously like a walkout. They refuse to tally grapes until their demands are met. Longer naps, more wine breaks, and sandals provided by the office budget. One even waves a sign scrawled with "More figs, less math" in dripping ink. Mainstream historical fact. Ancient Athens did witness labor unrest of sorts. Sailors, craftsmen, and even farmers sometimes protested harsh conditions or sought better terms from wealthy patrons. Records show strikes weren't formalized, but tensions often simmered beneath the surface. Watching a satyr barricade the amphorae with grape baskets, you realize myth has found its own version of labor revolt. The nymphs join in, forming what they call the union of vine and scroll. Their list of demands is written on papyrus twice as long as the ledger itself. Fair wages, better working quills, and an end to Dionysus's habit of counting joy as currency. Dionysus tries to negotiate, but they boo him off the barrel. A quirky tidbit comes to mind. In some Dionysian festivals, actors actually mocked political leaders on stage, blurring the line between myth and civic protest. Historians still argue whether these performances were tolerated satire or genuine dissent disguised as art. Here, the protest feels like both. A performance and a rebellion, equal parts chaos and comedy. Your light joke of the day arrives when one satyr dramatically resigns from his post as chief financial hoofvicer. He tosses down his vine tie, declaring, "You can't fire me, I quit," then immediately asks for severance pay in raisins. The nymphs cheer as though he's a martyr. By afternoon, the office is paralyzed. Ledgers lie unfinished, amphorae sit uncounted, and the donkey refuses to move, perhaps in solidarity. Dionysus finally stands, sighing deeply, and admits what you've suspected all along. Perhaps wine was never meant for spreadsheets. The words hang in the warm air like a reluctant truth. As the sun sinks, you record the day's collapse in the ledger, ink smearing under your weary hand. Office disbanded, satyrs revolted, nymphs unionized, Dionysus defeated by paperwork. You close the book slowly, realizing this chaotic little experiment in divine administration has finally run its course. The vineyard is hushed now, as if even the cicadas have grown weary of the chaos. You arrive to find the pergola empty, no satyrs squabbling, no nymphs brandishing petitions, no donkey braying in protest. Just Dionysus, seated alone on a half-cracked amphora, staring wistfully at a ledger with ink long since dried. His ivy crown droops, and for the first time, he looks less like the god of revelry and more like a tired manager who's lost his staff. He beckons you closer. It was a noble experiment, he sighs, but vines grow by the sun, not by the pen. Grapes ferment by nature, not by accounting. He flips the ledger open, chuckles softly at the doodles of sandal-wearing goats and entries marked quality assurance, drank entire amphora. What was I thinking? Mainstream historical fact. Dionysus was always more than just the god of wine. He represented liberation from order, the balance between chaos and control. Ancient Greek festivals in his honor deliberately broke social norms, a temporary release valve from the strict order of daily life. In hindsight, running an office was never his destiny. Quirky tidbit. Some ancient writers suggested that Dionysus taught humanity not only how to cultivate vines, but also how to let go of burdens. Historians still argue whether these myths were symbolic lessons in agriculture or allegories of freedom. You glance at the abandoned ledgers and think, maybe both. Your light joke of the day arrives when Dionysus tries one last time to modernize. He dramatically announces, "From now on, no more ledgers. We'll track production through interpretive dance." He flails wildly, nearly knocking over the last intact amphora. You manage to steady it, laughing despite yourself. By dusk, the satyrs wander back, sheepish but smiling, carrying flutes instead of quills. The nymphs return too, weaving garlands instead of balance sheets. Dionysus rises, lifts his goblet and declares, "The office is closed. Long live the party." The vineyard bursts into song and laughter, the air thick with the scent of fresh wine and ivy. The experiment in administration has ended, but the god of revelry has found his way back to himself. You jot one final line in the ledger before tucking it away. The vineyard office is no more. In its place, joy. And as night deepens, you realize you've witnessed something extraordinary. Not just the collapse of a ridiculous office, but the gentle reminder that some things were never meant to be balanced on a ledger. And now, with the vineyard quiet, let the story soften into something slower, easier. You sit back under the pergola, the warm night air wrapping around you like a blanket. The laughter of satyrs fades into the distance, the last notes of a flute carried off on the breeze. The stars above scatter across the sky, calm and patient, reminding you that even in the strangest tales, there is always stillness at the end. You breathe in deeply, catching the faint sweetness of crushed grapes lingering in the air. The ledgers are closed, the ink dried, the amphorae finally at rest, Numbers and tallies dissolve into silence, leaving only the rhythm of your own breath, steady and slow. Imagine the vines swaying gently, heavy with fruit, whispering with the wind as though they've always known their place, needing no balance sheet, no audit, no frantic counting. Just the turning of seasons, the quiet work of roots and rain, the patience of the earth itself. Let yourself sink into that thought, that not everything must be measured, not every day must be efficient. Some moments are meant simply to be lived, savored, and then let go. Like a sip of wine that lingers only long enough to remind you it was there. Your body grows heavier, relaxed, as though every muscle has finally set down its own ledger. The sounds of the vineyard fade into a hum, a lullaby stitched from crickets, rustling vines, and the faint echo of divine laughter. Close your eyes now. The story has ended, but its calm remains. Drift with it, lightly, as if carried in a goblet of moonlight, until even the god of revelry himself would nod and whisper, "Sleep." End of script. Sweet dreams. Em được sang tiếng Việt đậm chi.